A defiant love between Lila, a black schoolteacher, and Nate, a wealthy heir, ignites a firestorm at their wedding. When Ruby unveils a priceless legacy, the Hargroves' scorn turns to shock. But what is their next move? Secrets unravel in this tale of heart versus heritage. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Stay tuned for the twist. The summer heat pressed down on Savannah like a heavy quilt, thick and unyielding, the kind that made your shirt cling to your back within minutes of stepping outside. Lila Jackson stood in front of the chipped mirror in her one-bedroom apartment, her fingers smoothing the hem of a simple white sundress. The fabric was soft, a little faded at the edges, but it hugged her frame just right. Nothing fancy, but it felt like her. Overhead, the ceiling fan spun lazily, its blades creaking in a slow, uneven rhythm that mingled with the relentless hum of cicadas outside the open window. A faint breeze slipped through the screen, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of magnolias from the tree across the street. She reached up to touch the thin silver necklace at her throat, a delicate chain with a tiny crescent moon pendant, a gift from her grandmother who deworked the cotton fields decades ago. It was warm against her skin, a small anchor in the storm brewing inside her. Today wasn't just any day. It was the day the first official meeting with Nate's family, the Hargroves, before their wedding in 2 weeks. Lila's stomach twisted at the thought, a knot of nerves she couldn't shake. She'd met Nate's parents briefly once before, a stiff handshake and a few polite words at a coffee shop downtown. But this was different. This was dinner at their sprawling estate, a place she'd only seen in glossy photos on Nate's phone. White columns, manicured lawns, a fountain that looked like it belonged in a movie. It was a world away from the cracked sidewalks and sagging porches of her neighborhood, where folks sat on stoops with iced tea and waved to every passing car. She turned away from the mirror, her sandals clicking softly against the worn hardwood floor, and grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. The screen glowed with a photo of her and Nate, him grinning wide, his sandy hair tousled, her head resting on his shoulder, the Savannah River glinting behind them. She dialed her mom, Ruby, needing a voice to steady her. The line crackled for a second before Ruby's warm alto came through, laced with the clatter of mixing bowls in the background. "Hey, baby girl. You holding up over there?" Lila leaned against the counter, the edge digging into her hip. "Mama, what if they hate me?" "Like really hate me?" Ruby let out a low chuckle, the kind that always made Lila feel like everything might just be okay. "Oh, honey, they don't have to love you. They just have to respect you. And if they don't, I'll march right over with my rolling pin and fix that real quick. Ain't nobody messin' with my Lila." Lila smiled despite herself, picturing her mom storming the Hargrove estate in her flour-dusted apron, wielding that old wooden pin like a sword. "I'm serious, Mama. They're different. You should see their house. It's got columns taller than our whole building. Columns don't make a person, baby. Heart does. You got more heart than all them fancy folks put together. Now, you put that chin up and walk in there like you own the place. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," Lila said, her voice softening. I want this to work. For Nate. It will. You and that boy are solid. Don't let nobody tell you different." There was a pause, then Ruby added, "I'm making some cornbread for you to bring tonight. Little piece off Aaron. They can't hate a woman who feeds him, right?" Lila laughed, a small release of the tension coiled in her chest. "Right. Love you, Mama. Love you too, baby girl. Go get him." She hung up, the silence of the apartment settling back around her like a heavy shawl. She glanced at the clock. 4:37 p.m. Nate would be here soon. She grabbed her purse, a faded canvas tote with a sunflower stitched on the side, and took one last look in the mirror. "You got this," she whispered to her reflection, though the words felt more like a prayer than a promise. Half a mile away, Nathaniel Hargrove stood on the wide front porch of his family's estate, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the oak-lined driveway. The air smelled of cut grass, and the faint tang of the river drifting in from the east. He tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt, the crisp white fabric already sticking to his skin in the humidity. His fingers fidgeted with the silver ring on his left hand, a scratched-up old thing his granddad had given him years ago, with a gruff, "Keep it simple, Nate." He missed that old man granddad had been the only one in the family who didn't care about appearances, who'd have loved Lila the second he met her. The screen door creaked open behind him, and his mother, Eleanor, stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She was a vision of Southern elegance, blonde hair swept into a low chignon, a cream silk blouse tucked neatly into a pencil skirt, and those oversized pearl earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head. Her blue eyes narrowed as she looked him over, one manicured hand reaching out to adjust his collar. "You're a mess, Nathaniel," she said, her voice carrying that slow, syrupy drawl she'd perfected over decades of garden parties and charity galas. "I hope you know what you're doing tonight. This isn't just about you anymore." Nate swallowed, his throat dry. "I know, Mom. It's about Lila too." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest crease forming between her brows. "Yes, well, we'll see how that goes. Your father's already in a mood about it." "He doesn't have to like her," Nate said, a little too quickly. "He just has to." "Respect her?" Eleanor finished, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't be naive, darling. Respect is earned, and she has got a long way to go before she fits in here." "She fits with me," Nate shot back, his voice low but firm. "That's what matters." Eleanor sighed, brushing an invisible speck of lint from her sleeve. "We'll see. Just don't embarrass us tonight, Nathaniel. That's all I ask." She turned and disappeared back inside, the door swinging shut with a soft thud. Nate let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his gaze drifting to the row of ancient oaks lining the property. Their branches drooped heavy with Spanish moss, swaying gently in the breeze, a sight he'd loved as a kid, but now it felt like they were watching him, waiting to see if he'd buckle under the weight of all this. He pulled his keys from his pocket, the jingle cutting through the stillness, and headed for his truck, a beat-up Ford he'd kept despite his father's insistence on something flashier. Lila was waiting, and no matter what his parents thought, he wasn't about to let her face this alone. He climbed in, the engine rumbling to life, and drove off toward her place, the promise he'd made to her echoing in his head. "I've got your back, always." The old Ford rattled down Abercorn Street, its tires humming against the uneven pavement as Nate gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The cab smelled faintly of motor oil, and the pine air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror, a scent that always calmed him when the world felt too big. Outside, Savannah unfolded in a blur of pastel houses and wrought iron fences, the late afternoon sun painting everything in a golden haze. He passed a group of kids chasing each other through a sprinkler, their laughter cutting through the cicada drone, and for a moment he envied their carefree chaos. His own day was about to get a lot messier. He pulled up outside Lila's building, a squat, two-story affair with peeling beige paint and a rusty fire escape clinging to the side like an afterthought. She was already waiting on the stoop, her white sundress catching the light as she stood, brushing a curl from her forehead. Nate's chest loosened at the sight of her, the way it always did, like she was a lighthouse in a storm he hadn't even realized he was sailing through. He killed the engine and stepped out, the truck door creaking loud enough to make a stray cat dart under a parked car. "Hey," he called, shoving his hands in his pockets as he crossed the patchy lawn. "You look wow." Lila grinned, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks. You clean up pretty good yourself." She nodded at his shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows in a way his mother would hate. "Ready for the lioness den?" He laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Not even close." "But we've got this, right?" "Right," she said, though her fingers brushed the silver necklace at her throat, a telltale sign she was steadying herself. She hefted her tote bag onto her shoulder, and Nate noticed a small cardboard box tucked under her arm, tied with a piece of twine. "Mama sent cornbread. Said it might soften them up." "Smart woman," Nate said, opening the passenger door for her. "Let us hope they're in a carb-friendly mood." Lila slid into the seat, the springs groaning under her weight, and set the box on her lap. As Nate climbed back in and started the truck, she glanced at him sidelong. "They're not gonna eat it, are they?" He smirked, pulling onto the road. "Not a chance. Mom'll probably call it rustic and stash it in the pantry till it molds. But it's the thought that counts." She chuckled, leaning her head against the window, the glass cool against her temple. "Guess I'll take what I can get." The drive to the Hargrove estate took them out of the city's heart and into the quieter outskirts, where the streets widened and the houses grew grander, their lawns manicured to perfection. Nate stole glances at Lila as they went, watching her take in the shift past the gas stations and corner stores to the gated driveways and ivy-covered walls. Her expression stayed soft, but he could see the wheels turning behind her dark eyes, sizing up the distance between her world and his. When they reached the wrought iron gates of the estate, Nate punched a code into the keypad, and the gates swung open with a low groan. The driveway stretched ahead, flanked by towering oaks draped in Spanish moss, their shadows dancing across the gravel. At the end sat the house itself, 3 stories of white clapboard and black shutters, with a wraparound porch and columns that gleamed like they'd been polished yesterday. The fountain in the front yard gurgled softly, its marble cherubs spitting arcs of water into the air. Lila let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding about the columns." "Told you," Nate said, parking the truck beside a sleek black BMW his dad's pride and joy. "Just don't let him intimidate you. They're taller than they bite." She raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure that's not how the saying goes." He grinned, but it faded as he caught sight of his mother stepping onto the porch, her silhouette sharp against the open front door. "Here we go," he muttered, cutting the engine. "Stay close." They climbed out, the gravel crunching underfoot, and Lila clutched the cornbread box a little tighter as they approached. Eleanor stood waiting, her arms crossed, the pearl earrings glinting like tiny moons. Her gaze swept over Lila's dress, sandals, tote bag, and Nate saw the flicker of disapproval she didn't bother to hide. "Evening, Nathaniel," she said, then turned to Lila with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "And Lila, so glad you could make it." "Thanks for having me, Mrs. Hargrove," Lila replied, her voice steady despite the chill in the air. She held out the box. "My mom sent this. Homemade cornbread." Eleanor's fingers hesitated before taking it, holding it by the edges like it might stain her blouse. "How quaint," she said, the word dripping with something Lila couldn't quite name. "I'll have Margaret put it in the kitchen." "Come inside, one to you." Nate slipped his hand into Lila's as they followed, giving it a quick squeeze. The foyer swallowed them whole, polished marble floors, a chandelier dripping crystals, and a curved staircase that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. A massive oil painting hung above the mantel, generations of Hargroves, all pale and stern, staring down with unblinking eyes. Lila's sandals squeaked against the marble, and she winced, feeling every inch the outsider. Charles Hargrove emerged from the living room, a glass of bourbon in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his tailored slacks. His silver hair was slicked back, and the gold pocket watch chain glinted at his waist. He sized Lila up with a single glance, his mouth curling into a half smile that didn't feel friendly. Well, he said, his voice deep and rough from years of cigars. The bride-to-be? You're smaller than I pictured. Lila straightened, meeting his gaze. Good things come in small packages, Mr. Hargrove. He chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. Suppose we'll find out. Nate, you gonna stand there or get the girl a drink? I've got it, Nate said, steering Lila toward the living room. What do you want, water? Tea? Tea's fine, she said, her eyes flicking to the painting again. Those painted faces seemed to follow her, their silence louder than Charles's words. Eleanor set the cornbread box on a side table, brushing her hands as if wiping off crumbs that weren't there. Sit, please, she said, gesturing to a stiff-backed sofa upholstered in pale blue silk. Dinner's almost ready. Charles, why don't you tell Lila about the family? She ought to know what she is marrying into. Charles took a sip of his bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass. Hargroves built this town, darlin'. Hotels, land, you name it. Took grit and a hell of a lot of ambition, things you don't learn slinging books to high schoolers. Nate stiffened beside her, but Lila just smiled, tight and controlled. Teaching us more about heart than ambition, I'd say. But I'm sure you've got plenty of both. Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting the pushback. Heart, huh? That'll get you far. Far enough, Lila shot back, her voice calm but edged with steel. Eleanor cleared her throat, smoothing her skirt. Let us not get ahead of ourselves. Nathaniel, why don't you show Lila the garden before we eat? Give her a taste of what this family is about. Nate stood, offering Lila his hand. See, Mon. Fresh air'll do us good. As they stepped outside, the screen door banging shut behind them, Lila let out a breath she'd been holding. The garden stretched out in a riot of color, roses, hydrangeas, and those heavy magnolia blooms perfuming the air. She looked at Nate, his jaw tight, and squeezed his hand. They're testing me, she said quietly. They're testing us, he corrected, his voice low. But we're tougher than they think. She nodded, the silver necklace glinting in the fading light. Damn right we are. The garden air hung thick with the scent of magnolias, their creamy petals drooping under the weight of the evening heat. Lila stood beside Nate, her sandals sinking slightly into the soft earth as they wandered past a row of rose bushes, their thorns catching faint glints of the setting sun. The chatter from inside the house faded to a dull hum, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant croak of a frog near the fountain. Nate kicked at a pebble, sending it skittering across the stone path, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying more than just the night ahead. They're not always like this, he said, breaking the silence. Dad's just set in his ways. Mom, too. Lila tilted her head, studying him. Set in their ways, or set against me? He stopped walking, turning to face her. His hazel eyes flickered with something guilt, maybe, or frustration. It's not you, Lila. It's what they think you represent. She crossed her arms, the tote bag bumping against her hip. And what is that? Poor? Black? Not good enough for their golden boy. Nate winced, running a hand through his hair. They don't see you like I do. They see where you're from, what your mom does. It's stupid, I know. Stupid as one word for it, she said, her voice low but sharp. Cruel as another. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her elbow. I'm on your side, okay? Always. She softened at that, letting her arms drop. I know. Just don't let them make me feel small, Nate. I fought too hard to let that happen. You won, T, he promised, his thumb tracing a small circle on her arm. See, Mon, let us head back. Dinner is probably ready. They retraced their steps, the gravel crunching underfoot, and re-entered the house through the back door. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and buttery rolls, a stark contrast to the tension simmering in the dining room beyond. Margaret, the Hargroves' housekeeper, bustled past with a tray of crystal glasses, her gray bun bobbing as she nodded a quick hello. Lila caught her eye and smiled. Margaret was the only one here who hadn't looked at her like an intruder. The dining room glowed under a chandelier that threw flecks of light across the mahogany table, set with china so fine it looked like it might crack if you breathed on it. Charles sat at the head, swirling his bourbon, while Eleanor perched at the other end, her posture stiff as a mannequin. 2 empty chairs waited for Nate and Lila, flanked by a silver candelabra and a centerpiece of white lilies that smelled faintly of funerals. Sit, Eleanor said, waving a hand. We've held supper long enough. Nate pulled out Lila's chair, his fingers brushing her shoulder as she settled in. She smoothed her dress, feeling the weight of Charles' stare across the table. He set his glass down with a deliberate clink, the eyes shifting inside. So, Lila, he began, leaning back in his chair, Nathaniel says you're a teacher. Literature, was it? Yes, sir, she replied, folding her hands in her lap. High school. I teach kids how to think, not just what to read. Charles smirked, a glint of teeth showing. Think, huh? That's a tall order for teenagers. Most of them can barely tie their shoes. They surprise you sometimes, she said, meeting his gaze. Give him a chance, and they'll all run with it. Eleanor chimed in, her voice smooth as polished glass. How noble. Though I imagine it's not the most lucrative career. Savannah's schools aren't exactly rolling in money. Lila's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. It's not about the money. It's about making a difference. Difference, Charles echoed, cutting into his chicken with a slow, deliberate slice. Funny word. Difference can mean a lot of things, good, bad, or just out of place. Nate's fork clattered against his plate. Dad, can we not do this? Do what? Charles said, raising an eyebrow. I'm just getting to know her. I'm that what tonight's for. It's fine, Nate, Lila said, though her knuckles whitened around her napkin. Mr. Hargrove, if you've got something to say, just say it. Charles paused, his knife hovering over his plate. All right, then. You're a sweet girl, Lila. Got a spark, I'll give you that. But this family is built on more than sparks. It's built on legacy hotels, investments, a name that means something around here. What does your family bring to the table? Cornbread? The room went still, the only sound the faint tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, while Nate's face flushed red. Charles, Eleanor said, her tone a warning wrapped in silk, let us not be rude. I'm not rude, he shot back, pointing his fork at Lila. I'm realistic. She's marrying into this. She ought to know what's what. Lila set her napkin down, her movements slow and deliberate. My family brings heart, Mr. Hargrove. Loyalty. Hard work. Things you can't buy at a hotel gift shop. Charles barked a laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. Heart's nice, darlin'. One pay the bills, though. Enough, Nate snapped, his chair scraping as he half stood. She's not here to audition for you. Sit down, Nathaniel, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through like a blade. We're having a conversation. It's not a conversation, Nate said, his hands gripping the table. It's a damn interrogation. Lila touched his arm, her fingers cool against his skin. It's okay, she said softly. I can handle it. He sank back into his seat, but his eyes stayed on his father, hard and unyielding. Charles took another sip of bourbon, unfazed, while Eleanor dabbed her mouth with a napkin, the pearls at her ears swaying slightly. Let us talk about something else, she said, steering the room back to calm waters. The wedding. Nathaniel, have you thought about the guest list? We'll need to invite the Thompsons' old friends from the club. I don't care about the Thompsons, Nate muttered, stabbing at his roll. This isn't their day. It's not just your day, either, Charles said, his tone darkening. It's ours, too. Hargrove may mess on the line. Lila pushed her plate away, the chicken barely touched. Funny how a name can weigh so much, she said, almost to herself. Must be exhausting carrying it around. Charles's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the doorbell chimed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the house. Eleanor frowned, glancing at Margaret as she hurried to answer it. Who'd he come by this late? Charles grumbled, setting his glass down. Margaret returned a moment later, her face flushed. It's a Mrs. Jackson, ma'am. Says she is here for Lila? Lila's head snapped up, a mix of relief and dread washing over her. Mama? Ruby stepped into the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour, a woven basket slung over one arm. Her dark eyes scanned the room, landing on Charles and Eleanor with a look that could peel paint. Evenin', folks, she said, her voice warm but edged. Thought I'd drop by with a little something extra. Didn't he want my girl fasten this crowd empty-handed? Eleanor rose, her smile tight. Mrs. Jackson, how unexpected. We were just finishing supper. Looks like I'm right on time, then, Ruby said, setting the basket on the table. She pulled back a checkered cloth, revealing a stack of golden cornbread muffins, their edges crisp and steaming. Figured why all might need a taste of home. Charles stared at the basket, his jaw ticking. We've got plenty of food, ma'am. Plenty ain't the same as good, Ruby replied, unfazed. She turned to Lila, her gaze softening. You holding up, baby? Yeah, Mama, Lila said, standing to hug her. I'm good. Nate stood too, offering Ruby a small smile. Thanks for coming, Mrs. Jackson. Anytime, sugar, she said, patting his cheek. Then, to Charles and Eleanor, why all enjoy the muffins. Might sweeten you up a bit. The air thickened as Ruby's words hung there, a challenge wrapped in kindness. Charles's hand tightened around his glass, but he said nothing. Eleanor picked up a muffin with 2 fingers, holding it like a foreign object. Thank you, she said, her voice brittle. Margaret, take this to the kitchen, please. As Ruby linked arms with Lila and led her toward the door, Nate followed, leaving Charles and Eleanor staring after them. The night wasn't over, but the first cracks had begun to show sharp, jagged lines in a facade that wouldn't hold much longer. The morning sun crept over Savannah, spilling golden light through the cracked blinds of Ruby's bakery. The little shop sat tucked between a laundromat and a barber on a street where the pavement buckled from years of heat and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of yeast and cinnamon, a warm cocoon against the world outside. Ruby stood behind the counter, her hands buried in a mound of dough, kneading it with a rhythm born of decades. Her voice rose in a soft hum, swing low, sweet chariot the notes, weaving through the clatter of mixing bowls, and the whir of an ancient fan propped in the corner. Lila sat on a stool near the window, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands, the chip mug warm against her palms. She wore an old t-shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, strands escaping to frame her face. The tension from last night still clung to her like a second skin, but being here, with the familiar creak of the floorboards and her mama's voice, loosened it just a little. She traced a finger along the rim of the mug, watching Ruby's hands work the dough into a smooth, elastic ball. You didn't have to come last night, Mama, Lila said, breaking the quiet. I was holding my own. Ruby didn't look up, just kept kneading, her knuckles pressing deep. Maybe you were, baby girl. But I was about to let them Hargroves think they could run you ragged without a fight. That cornbread was my way of saying we ain't scared. Lila smiled, small but real. They didn't eat it, you know. Mama Hargrove looked at it like it was gonna bite her. Let him starve, then, Ruby said, slapping the dough onto the counter with a thud. Folks like that don't know good when it's staring 'em in the face. Too busy polishing their silver spoons. Lila took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding her. Nate's not like them. He stood up for me. Ruby paused, wiping her hands on her apron, flour dusting the air like fine snow. She fixed Lila with a look sharp, knowing. He is a good boy, I'll give him that. But he has still their blood, Lila. Blood as thicker than promises sometimes. He is different, Lila insisted, setting the mug down. You should ve seen his face when his daddy started in on me. He was mad, Mama. Real mad? Ruby nodded, slow and thoughtful. Mad as a start. But it's gonna take more than mad to stand against folks like that. You sure he is ready? Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing the silver necklace. He is trying. That is what counts, right? Trying is half the battle, Ruby said, rolling the dough into a log. Just make sure he don't quit when it gets hard. 'Cause it will, baby. It will. The bell above the door jingled, and Nate stepped in, his boots scuffing the worn linoleum. He carried the morning's humidity with him, his shirt damp at the collar, the silver ring glinting on his finger as he waved. Mornin', ladies. Smells like heaven in here. Mornin', sugar, Ruby said, flashing him a grin. You hungry? Got some biscuits coming out soon. Always, Nate said, sliding onto the stool next to Lila. He leaned over, kissing her cheek, his breath warm against her skin. You okay after last night? Yeah, she said, leaning into him. You? He shrugged, his jaw tight. Still pissed. Dad was out of line, and Mom just sat there like it was nothing. I'm sorry, Lila. Don't be, she said, squeezing his hand. You didn't do it. Ruby watched them, her eyes narrowing slightly as she shaped the dough into rounds. Why all got a plan for this wedding yet? 'Cause after last night, I reckon them Hargroves ain't gonna make it easy. We're working on it, Nate said, glancing at Lila. Thought we'd keep it small church, maybe a little reception here, if that's okay with you, Mrs. Jackson. Here? Ruby raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at her lips. Boy, you trying to charm me? Is it workin'? He asked, grinning back. Might be, she said, sliding the tray into the oven. Long as you don't let your folks turn it into some fancy circus. No chance, Lila said. I want it simple. Us, some friends, good food. No chandeliers. Nate nodded, but his grin faded. They're pushing for something big. Mom's already talking guest lists half the damn country club. Dad says it's about the family name. Name's just noise, Ruby said, wiping her hands on a rag. What matters is what's real. You two hold tight to that. We will, Lila said, her voice firm. Right, Nate? Right, he echoed, though his eyes flickered with doubt. Across town, the Hargrove estate buzzed with a different kind of energy. Charles sat in his study, a wood-paneled cave of leather and cigar smoke, the morning paper spread across his desk unread. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust motes swirling in the air, but the room felt heavy, shadowed by the man at its center. He tapped his gold pocket watch against the desk, a steady tick-tick that matched the pulse in his temple. Eleanor stood by the bookshelf, flipping through a ledger, her pearl earrings swaying as she moved. We can't let this go on, Charles, she said, her voice low but urgent. That girl's mother showing up last night, flour on her hands, acting like she owns the place. It's a disgrace. Charles snorted, leaning back in his chair. Disgrace is Nathaniel thinking he can drag that family into ours. A baker and a schoolteacher? Hell, Eleanor, we've got standards. They're not our kind, she agreed, snapping the ledger shut. But he is stubborn. Always has been, since he was a boy. Then we make him see reason, Charles said, his fingers tightening around the watch. Wedding's coming up. Perfect chance to show him what he has thrown away. Eleanor turned, her eyes sharp. What were you thinking? The engagement party, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. We invite the right people, Thompsons, Carters, all the old money. Let him see Lila and her mama in that crowd. She'll fold, or he will. Either way, they'll crack. And if they don't? Eleanor asked, crossing her arms. Charles's grin hardened. Then we push harder. Nathaniel is soft, but he has still a Hargrove. He'll come around when he sees what is at stake. Eleanor nodded, her lips thinning. I'll call Margaret, get the invitations out. We'll need something grand, garden party, live music. Make it impossible for them to fit in. Good, Charles said, standing to pour another bourbon from the decanter on the sideboard. The amber liquid glugged into the glass, catching the light. And that cornbread nonsense? Make sure it's nowhere near the table. I ain't having it. Eleanor smirked, a rare crack in her polish. Oh, I'll bury it in the pantry. Let the mice have it. They shared a look, cold, calculated, a silent pact sealed over years of privilege. Outside, the oaks swayed in the breeze, their mossy tendrils brushing the ground, but inside, the air was still, heavy with the weight of their plans. Back at the bakery, the oven dinged, and Ruby pulled out a tray of biscuits, their tops golden and glistening with butter. She set them on the counter, the heat rising in waves, and handed one to Nate, then Lila. Eat up, she said. Why, all gonna need your strength. Lila broke her biscuit in half, steam curling up between her fingers. You think they'll back off, Mama? Ruby shook her head, her eyes dark with certainty. Not a chance, baby girl. Folks like that don't bend, they break things. You just make sure they don't break you. Nate chewed his biscuit, the taste rich and comforting, but his mind was elsewhere on the estate, on the fight he knew was coming. He squeezed Lila's knee under the counter, a silent vow to stand with her, even as the roots of his family tangled tighter around them both. The Hargrove estate shimmered under the late afternoon sun, transformed into a spectacle of southern grandeur for the engagement party. Strings of Edison bulbs crisscrossed above the garden, their glow soft against the deepening blue of the sky. Long tables draped in white linen lined the lawn, laden with silver platters of shrimp cocktail, deviled eggs, and miniature pecan tarts, their edges glistening with caramelized sugar. A three-piece jazz band played lazily from a corner near the magnolia trees, the saxophone's mournful wail drifting over the chatter of guests in seersucker suits and pastel dresses. The air carried the briny tang of the nearby river, mingling with the heavy perfume of flowers, and the sharp bite of bourbon from tumblers clutched in manicured hands. Lila stepped out of Nate's truck, her heels borrowed from a friend sinking into the gravel as she smoothed the skirt of her dress. It was a deep teal number, sleeveless and simple, the fabric catching the light as she moved. She spent an hour twisting her hair into an elegant updo, a few curls escaping to frame her face, and the silver necklace gleamed at her throat. Beside her, Nate adjusted his tie, a muted gray that clashed with the loud confidence of the crowd. His boots scuffed the ground, kicking up tiny clouds of dust, and he shot her a sidelong glance. You look incredible, he said, his voice low enough to stay between them. She managed a smile, though her stomach churned. Thanks. Feel like I'm walking into a lion's den wearing steak. He chuckled, taking her hand. We'll stick together. Promise. They crossed the lawn, the grass soft underfoot, and heads turned as they passed some subtle, others blatant, eyes lingering on Lila's dress, her skin, the way she held herself. The guests were a sea of wealth, men with Rolexes flashing at their wrists, women with diamond studs winking in the twilight. Lila caught snippets of conversation. Who is she? Hargrove's boy, really? The word sharp as thorns beneath the polite hum. Eleanor stood near the fountain, a vision in pale yellow chiffon, her pearl earrings swaying as she greeted a couple in matching linen suits. She spotted Nate and Lila, her smile tightening like a drawstring pulled too hard. "Nathaniel, darling," she called, gliding over. "And Lila. Don't you look striking?" "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove," Lila said, her tone even. "This is beautiful. You've outdone yourself." Eleanor waved a hand, the gesture dismissive. "Oh, it's nothing. Just a little something for the occasion. Come, let me introduce you." She led them to a cluster of guests near the band, older men with ruddy cheeks and women with hair sprayed into stiff perfection. "Everyone, this is Lila Jackson, Nathaniel's fiancée. Lila, these are the Thompsons and the Carters, old friends of the family." A man with a gray mustache, Mr. Thompson, Lila guessed, extended a meaty hand. "Pleasure, Miss Jackson. Hargroves throw a hell of a party, don't they?" "They do," Lila said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes flicked over her like he was sizing up a horse at auction. Mrs. Carter, a woman with a string of pearls around her neck, tilted her head. "Jackson, I don't believe I know the name. Are your people from Savannah?" "Born and raised," Lila replied, smiling. "My mama runs a bakery downtown." "A bakery?" Mrs. Carter's eyebrows lifted, her tone hovering between curiosity and pity. "How charming." Before Lila could respond, Charles's voice boomed across the lawn. "Folks, gather round. Time for a little toast." The crowd shifted, forming a loose circle near the fountain. Charles stood on a low platform, bourbon in hand, his pocket watch chain glinting against his vest. Eleanor joined him, her arm brushing his, a united front of polished power. Nate pulled Lila closer, his hand tight around hers. "To my son, Nathaniel," Charles began, his voice carrying over the rustle of leaves, "and his choice of bride, Lila Jackson. This family has stood tall for generations, built on hard work, ambition, and a name folks respect from here to Charleston. Tonight, we celebrate that legacy and what is to come." The applause was polite but thin, a ripple rather than a wave. Charles's eyes locked on Lila, his grin sharp. "Now, tradition says the groom's folks give a little something to mark the occasion. Eleanor and I were given the happy couple a week at our beach house on Tybee, full staff, ocean views, the works." More clapping, louder this time, murmurs of approval rippling through the crowd. Nate stiffened beside Lila, his jaw clenching. She squeezed his hand, her pulse quickening as Charles raised his glass higher. "And I reckon the bride's side ought to chip in too," he added, his tone turning sly. "Lila, what is your mama bringing to this union? Something to match, I hope?" Laughter scattered through the guests, light but cutting. Lila's throat tightened, but before she could speak, the crunch of tires on gravel drew every eye to the driveway. Ruby's old hatchback rolled to a stop, its paint chipped and faded, a stark contrast to the gleaming sedans lining the lot. She stepped out, her floral dress swaying as she carried a wooden box under one arm, her chin high despite the stairs. "Evenin', why all," Ruby called, striding across the lawn like she owned it. "Heard there was a party." Charles's grin faltered, bourbon sloshing in his glass. Eleanor's hand flew to her pearls, her lips parting in a silent gasp. Nate stepped forward, relief washing over his face. "Mrs. Jackson, glad you made it." "Wouldn't he miss it," Ruby said, winking at Lila. She set the box on a table, the wood scratched and weathered, and faced Charles head on. "You asked what I'm bringin'. This here it." She lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed pages bound with twine, handwritten sheets, ink faded but legible, the edges curling from age. The crowd leaned in, curiosity overriding their smirks. "My great-grandmama wrote these," Ruby said, her voice steady. "She worked the fields right here in Savannah, back when folks like you owned folks like us. These are her words, poems, stories, prayers. One of 'em carved on that freedom monument downtown. Historians been hunting it for years. Worth more than your beach house, I reckon, but we don't sell our soul. The air went still, the jazz band faltering mid-note. Mr. Thompson coughed, his mustache twitching. Mrs. Carter's pearls clinked as she shifted uncomfortably. Charles's face darkened, his knuckles white around his glass. That's quite a tale, he said, forcing a laugh. But this ain't a history lesson, ma'am. No, Ruby shot back, it's a reckoning. My girl has marrying into your family, but she has bringing her own legacy, one you can't buy or bury. Lila stepped beside her mama, her voice ringing clear. That is right. And I'm proud of it. Nate joined them, his arm around Lila's shoulders. So am I. Dad, Mom, this stops now. Eleanor's smile cracked, her eyes darting to the guests. Nathaniel, don't make a scene. Too late, he said, his voice hard. You wanted to test us? We're done playing. Charles slammed his glass down, the sound sharp as a gunshot. You think this changes anything? She is still. Enough. Lila snapped, her eyes blazing. You don't get to decide what I'm worth. The crowd hushed, tension coiling tight. Ruby picked up her box, nodding to Lila and Nate. Let us go, babies. Ain't no point wasting breath on folks who don't hear. They turned, walking back to the hatchback, the guests parting like a sea. Charles shouted after them, You'll regret this, Nathaniel. But his voice drowned in the murmur of the crowd, now buzzing with whispers, some shocked, some awed. As Ruby drove them away, the estate shrinking in the rear view, Lila leaned against Nate, the wooden box on her lap. The night was far from over, but the stage had shifted and the Hargroves' perfect script had just been torn apart. The bakery glowed under the soft flicker of string lights looped across the ceiling, a far cry from the Hargrove estate's glittering chandeliers. The air inside Ruby's shop was warm, thick with the scent of cornbread, fried chicken, and the sweet tang of peach cobbler cooling on the counter. Wooden tables, scratched and worn from years of use, were pushed together in the center of the room, draped with mismatched cloths, red gingham, faded blue, a floral one Ruby swore she'd sewn herself decades back. A handful of folding chairs sat scattered around, occupied by a small crew of friends and neighbors, their laughter mingling with the crackle of a portable speaker playing old gospel tunes, This Little Light of Mine buzzing through the static. Lila stood in the tiny back room, smoothing the skirt of her wedding dress, a simple ivory gown with lace at the neckline, borrowed from a cousin, but altered to fit her just right. Her hair hung loose, curls cascading over her shoulders, a single magnolia blossom tucked behind her ear. The silver necklace rested against her collarbone, its crescent moon catching the dim light from a bare bulb overhead. She caught her reflection in a cracked hand mirror propped on a shelf, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in her chest unraveled. This was the wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl. No grand hall, no 100 guests, but it felt right, like coming home. Ruby poked her head in, her floral dress swapped for a burgundy one with a wide belt, her apron traded for a string of faux pearls. You ready, baby girl? That boy out there's passing like a cat on a hot roof. Lila grinned, setting the mirror down. Ready as I'll ever be, Mama. Ruby stepped closer, adjusting the magnolia in Lila's hair, her fingers gentle but firm. You're beautiful. Always have been. Don't need no fancy estate to prove that. Thanks, Mama, Lila said, her voice catching. She hugged Ruby tight, breathing in the familiar scent of flour and vanilla clinging to her skin. Out front, Nate stood by the counter, tugging at the cuffs of his white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He'd ditched the tie his mother had pressed him to wear, opting instead for a pair of dark slacks and his trusty boots, scuffed but polished for the occasion. The silver ring gleamed on his finger, a quiet tether to the man He wanted to be not the Hargrove heir, but Lila's husband. A few friends clapped him on the back. Tommy from the garage, Miss Ella from down the street, their voices a low hum of encouragement. The door creaked open, and Lila stepped out, Ruby trailing behind. The room went quiet, save for the speaker as Tinningham. Nate's breath hitched, his eyes locking on her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Goddamn, Lila," he murmured, loud enough for Tommy to snicker. She laughed, crossing the room to him, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "You clean up nice yourself, Hargrove." He took her hands, his thumbs brushing her knuckles. "Ready to do this?" "Born ready," she said, squeezing back. Ruby clapped her hands, drawing every eye. "All right, let us get this show rollin'. Preacher is runnin' late, so I'm officiatin' till he gets here. Ain't nobody better at bossin' folks around than me." Laughter rippled through the room as Ruby took her place between them, a worn Bible in hand, one her grandmama had carried through harder days. "We ain't got no fancy vows written," she said, "so speak from your hearts. Nate, you first." Nate cleared his throat, his grip tightening on Lila's hands. "Lila, I ain't good with words like you are. But I know you're the best thing that has ever happened to me. You're strong, smart, and you make me want to be better every damn day. I promise to stand by you, fight for you, and love you till I'm old and gray. Maybe even after that." A few ahs floated up from the chairs. Lila blinked back tears, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Nate, you see me, all of me, not just the parts folks want to judge. You got a heart bigger than this whole town, and I promise to hold it gentle, to build something real with you, no matter what comes. I love you, always will." Ruby sniffed, fanning her face with the Bible. "Lord, why all trying to make me cry for the chickeness even served? Rings, now let us keep this movin'." Nate pulled a simple band from his pocket, silver with magnolia etched inside, and slipped it onto Lila's finger. "Made it myself," he said, sheepish. "Well, Tommy helped." Lila slid a matching band onto his, her hands trembling just a little. Miss Ella pitched in on this one. "Team effort." Ruby grinned. "By the power vested in me, and a little gospel grit, I pronounce why all husband and wife. Kiss her, Nate, for I do it myself." He didn't hesitate, pulling Lila close, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and defiance. The room erupted clapping. Whoops, Miss Ella's high-pitched hallelujah, as the speaker kicked into "Oh Happy Day." The reception spilled out fast, plates piled with food, sweet tea sloshing in mason jars, folks dancing in the cramped space between tables. Ruby hauled out a cobbler, its crust golden and bubbling, and Tommy dragged Nate into a clumsy two-step while Lila laughed, her dress swishing around her knees. Hours later, the crowd thinned, leaving just the three of them, Lila, Nate, and Ruby, sitting on stools with leftover cornbread crumbs scattered across the counter. The lights dimmed, the speaker silent, the night pressing soft against the windows. "Best wedding I ever been to," Ruby said, kicking off her shoes. "And I've been to a few." Lila leaned her head on Nate's shoulder, the magnolia wilting slightly in her hair. "Ours too." Nate kissed her temple, his arm around her. "No regrets?" "None," she said, her voice sure. Outside, a shadow lingered. Charles and Eleanor, parked across the street in their BMW, the engine idling. Charles gripped the wheel, his pocket watch abandoned on the dash, its chain glinting in the streetlight. Eleanor stared at the bakery, her pearls still at her throat, her face unreadable. "They're happy," she said, almost a whisper. Charles grunted, his jaw tight. "For now." He shifted into gear, pulling away, the car's hum fading into the night. Inside, Lila and Nate stood, gathering plates, while Ruby hummed Amazing Grace, her voice threading through the quiet. The bakery held them close, small, worn, unbreakable, and as the stars blinked over Savannah, they stepped into their new life, roots tangled but strong, ready for whatever lay ahead. The first light of autumn crept over Savannah, softer now, the summer's brutal edge dulled by September's cooler breath. Ruby's bakery sat quiet in the early hour, its windows fogged with the steam of a fresh batch of biscuits rising in the oven. The street outside was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement, their edges curling brown. Inside, the air hummed with the familiar flour dust settling on the counter, the faint crackle of the old radio Ruby kept tuned to a gospel station, and the steady drip of coffee into a pot that'd seen better days. Lila stood behind the counter, her apron tied loose over a sweater and jeans, her wedding band catching the light as she rolled out dough. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, the magnolia long gone, but its memory lingering in the way she carried herself steady, rooted. Beside her, Nate perched on a stool, a mug of black coffee in one hand, a pencil in the other, sketching on a napkin. His boots tapped a restless rhythm against the floor, the silver ring on his finger scuffed but shining. They'd been married 3 months now, living in a rented shotgun house a few blocks away, narrow, creaky, theirs. "What you drawin'?" Lila asked, glancing over as she pressed a biscuit cutter into the dough. Nate tilted the napkin, revealing a rough outline of a storefront, big windows, a sign above the door. "Thinking about that cafe idea again. Something small, maybe near the river. Coffee, biscuits, your mama's cobbler on the menu." She smiled, dusting her hands on her apron. "Sounds like a dream worth chasing. You gonna quit the hotel gig?" He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Maybe. Dad has still got me on a leash, family business, and all that. But I'm tired of it, Lila. I want something that's ours." "Then do it," she said, her voice firm but warm. "We'll figure it out. Always do." The bell jingled, and Ruby bustled in from the back, a crate of peaches balanced on her hip. Her burgundy dress swapped for a denim one today, but the faux pearls stayed, swinging as she set the crate down with a grunt. "Mornin', why all?" "These came from Miss Ella, says her tree is droppin' fruit faster than she can eat it." "Perfect for cobbler," Lila said, eyeing the haul. "Thanks, Mama." Ruby waved her off, grabbing a mug to pour herself some coffee. "How is that house treating you too? Roof still holdin'?" "Barely," Nate said, chuckling. "Leaks when it rains, but we've got buckets. Feels more like home than the estate ever did." "Home's where you make it," Ruby said, settling onto a stool across from them. "Why all hear from them Hargroves lately?" Lila's hands paused over the dough, her jaw tightening just a fraction. "Not since the wedding. Nate saw his mom at the hotel last week, though." Nate nodded, his pencil stilling. "She didn't say much, just asked how I was, handed me some paperwork for the trust fund. Looked like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. They'll all come around," Ruby said, though her tone held no certainty. "Or they won't. Ain't your burden to carry either way." Lila pressed out another biscuit, her movements deliberate. "I don't need him to. We've got enough right here." The radio crackled, shifting to "How Great Thou Art," and Ruby hummed along, her voice threading through the quiet. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its horn blaring once, and a stray cat darted across the street, tail flicking. The bakery felt small but alive, a heartbeat pulsing through its worn walls. Nate set his napkin down, the sketch crinkled at the edges. "Got a call from a guy downtown yesterday. Says he has got a spot open, old barbershop, cheap rent. Might be worth a look." Lila's eyes lit up, flour smudging her cheek as she turned to him. "When do we go?" "Tomorrow, if you're free," he said, grinning. "Bring your mama's recipes. We'll need him." Ruby laughed, a deep, rolling sound. "Why all gonna put me out of business? Better save me a seat at that cafe." "Always," Lila said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. The door swung open again, and Tommy poked his head in, grease stains on his shirt from the garage. "Mornin', folks. Smell them biscuits from 2 blocks away. Any spares?" "Take your pick," Ruby said, nodding to a basket on the counter. "But you owe me a dance next time we throw a party." "Deal," Tommy said, grabbing 2 and disappearing back into the day. Lila watched him go, then turned to Nate, her voice soft. "This is it, huh? Our life." He leaned over, kissing her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "Yeah. And it's damn good." Across town, the Hargrove estate loomed silent, its columns stark against the graying sky. Charles sat on the porch, a cigar smoldering between his fingers, the ash falling unnoticed onto the boards. His pocket watch lay on the table beside him, unopened, its chain coiled like a snake. Eleanor stood at the railing, her cream sweater draped over her shoulders, pearls glinting faintly. They hadn't spoken much since the wedding words were replaced by a heavy, unspoken rift. "Mail came," she said finally, breaking the stillness. "Letter from Nathaniel. Says they're doing fine." Charles grunted, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Fine as a low bar." "They're happy," Eleanor countered, her voice thin. "You saw it that night." He didn't answer, just stared out at the oaks, their moss swaying slow and mournful. Eleanor's hand brushed the railing, her nails tapping once, twice. "I found the cornbread in the pantry yesterday," she said. "Moldy as sin. Threw it out." Charles's mouth twitched, a ghost of a smirk. "Should V done that day one." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the driveway, empty now, no truck rumbling up its length. The fountain bubbled on, a hollow sound against the quiet, and the magnolias drooped, their blooms fading with the season. Back at the bakery, the days stretched on, lazy and full. Lila slid a tray of biscuits into the oven, Nate sketched beside her, and Ruby sang, her voice rising over the radio's hum. The wooden box, the one holding her great-grandmama's pages, sat on a shelf behind the counter, a quiet sentinel of their past. It wasn't the centerpiece anymore, just a piece of the whole, like the rings on their fingers or the laughter in the air. Outside, a breeze stirred the street, lifting a single magnolia petal from a tree across the way. It drifted, caught the light, and settled on the bakery's stoop, a silent blessing on a life built not on wealth or name, but on love, grit, and the roots that held them fast. And as the sun climbed higher, they kept building, one biscuit, one sketch, one day at a time, free in a way the Hargroves never would be. The end.